Hello there. This lecture is really devoted to helping you have the bare essential basics of what you need to know to understand how to interpret journal articles. So I don't expect any of you to have a background in statistics or research methods or to have ever read a journal article. If you have, that's great, you're ahead of the game. But if you haven't, this lecture should get you up to speed so that you're prepared for the journal article summary assignments. So we're really going to start with square one about how to identify, access, and evaluate the quality of scholarly journal articles. Although you aren't going to be accessing journal articles in this class, I will be giving them to you. This is really useful information just to understand the context behind how we're accessing these journal articles and what a journal article is. And then if you ever need to do this in the future, you'll know how to do it. The heart of this lecture is going to focus on making sense of those journal articles. So how to understand what is the purpose of this study, to decide whether or not it's worth reading, even though again, I'm going to be assigning these to you, but you will be summarizing the purpose of the study for me. Then looking at how to interpret the findings or the results of the study using my favorite thing, statistics, and then how those findings can actually inform real world things. Like how would you actually apply what the article suggests in a real organization? So real quick, I just want to emphasize the difference between a scholarly journal article and something that is less rigorous, like a magazine. So if you look at this list, you'll see that scholarly journals are often written by professors or experts in a field of study, whereas popular magazines are often written by non-specialists or journalists and are often, really dictated by editors, right? Editors are who gives it the seal of approval, whereas scholarly journals go through a really rigorous peer review process where they send the manuscript to a group of people who are experts in that field, who know the research well, and then they evaluate that manuscript to see if it actually deserves to be published. Many times a author or a couple authors will send off their, blood, sweat, and tears in a manuscript to a journal, and those peer reviewers will send back a host of revisions that need to happen before they will publish it, if you're lucky. It's really hard to get published. A lot of times you send off your article and they say, not good enough, and they send it back with a rejection. But if you do a good job, you can get some feedback, you can incorporate it, revise, resubmit, and then hopefully get published. Let's see. So oftentimes, if you're reading a scholarly journal article, you will know because you will see citations and references. Popular magazines don't often have that and are usually based on opinion. Also, if you just look at the way a scholarly journal versus a popular magazine looks, you can definitely tell the difference. So as you can see here, a scholarly journal is really text-based. It's not very sexy. There's no frills. It starts with an abstract. You're going to see authors with a institutional affiliation or where they're doing their research, what college or university they work for. Then popular magazines often have catchy graphics and are kind of, more fun looking, to be honest, and aren't so academic. Now, although you will not need to access journal articles in this class, I just wanted to show you some of the ways that you as a Nevada State College student can get free access to journal articles if you need to do research, or if you're just curious about things and you want to do research on your own, or if it's assigned in a class. Keep in mind, oftentimes journal articles are really expensive. If you just go on Google and you look up research and you want to find it and you don't have a institutional account through a college or university, you could be charged up to $60 for one journal article. Trust me, researchers are trying to get around that. The researchers don't actually see that money. It goes to the journal. And us researchers, we really want people to read our work. So there's a push for having free open access journals. ResearchGate is one website that's really helping pioneer that field where people can publish their research and anybody can access it for free. But for now, you need to be affiliated with a research account usually through a college or university to get that for free. So if you go to nsc.edu/library, you can get access to journal articles. You see a search tab right there. You can also do more advanced searches through there. If you have the psychology databases tab in your module on Canvas, you can use that. It'll take you right to kind of where this will take you. Also, there's a resources tab in Canvas. This is what it looks like for now. And if you click that, it'll take you to the library. And then my favorite thing to use is Google Scholar. So Google Scholar is nice because there's some complicated ways to do database searches through the library, but Google Scholar functions much like what we're used to with Google. And if you're at home, if you're at the college and you use Google Scholar and you do a search, you'll see a little Find It at NSC tab pop up next to what you get. But if you're not at the college, you can go to Settings and you can actually put in your NSC credentials and be able to search from home and get free access to those articles through Nevada State College. So it's important to note that not all journals are created equal. There are some journals that are more prestigious, publish more high impact articles, have a more impressive editorial board, more impressive people who are publishing there and reviewing for them. And then other journals are maybe, up and coming or just started out and aren't as picky about what kind of articles they'll accept and also don't have as high of an impact in the field. So the way that we measure impact is called an impact factor, and it's a numerical ratio that tells you really how many citations did that article have versus how many articles they've published. So an impact factor really is, if it has a high impact factor, that means that other people and other studies are citing the articles that are published in that journal more than other journals. So here's some considerations. The reason that you have a ratio, you have a fraction here, is because you're really controlling for the number of articles published. You don't want to have a high impact factor that's just there because they publish everything that's given to them, and just because they're publishing more, they get more citations. You're really trying to control for, okay, it's more quality over quantity. Also, review articles and review journals are cited more. Review articles and review journals aren't really talking about or discussing empirical research that somebody conducted. It's like, here's all the studies that have been conducted on this topic so far. And so because of that, they're cited really often because it's a really nice source of information for somebody who's publishing on a topic. They can be like, instead of citing all these tons of articles that have happened, I'm going to cite this one review article that really talks about the whole history of this field of study and where it is today. Also, different specialties have different ranges of impact factors, but in psychology, around a 2 or greater is considered a high quality journal. And there's websites, you can see the link up there, that will tell you really quickly what is the impact factor of journals. So you can see that right here. Whenever I go to publish something, I usually start by aiming really high. So I find a couple of journals that are really relevant to what I'm studying. So there's tons of different journals that have tons of different emphasis. I typically study the scholarship of teaching. So a journal that I like to publish in is the Journal of Teaching and Psychology, or I've tried to publish in some statistics-based journals of teaching statistics. But you start by finding a journal that is relevant to what you're studying. Then you look at the impact factor and usually start by trying to publish in a really high impact journal. That tends to be more impressive. So journal articles have a pretty standard recipe, regardless of what field of study you're looking at. If you're looking at business or psychology or medical journals, they all have these different components. So the first thing you'll see in a journal article after the title and the authors is the abstract. And it's really just a quick and dirty summary of the key points of the article. What's like the minimal background for this study? And then it really focuses mostly on, what were the findings and the key takeaways. Keep in mind, you cannot read an abstract and have a full understanding of a journal article. It is not going to get you there. An abstract is really designed so that somebody who's conducting research can quickly decide if that article is actually relevant to what they're trying to figure out. Because you don't just do a study from your brain and go, I'm going to see if this is, this is happening in the real world, or I'm interested in this topic, so I'm going to study it. Before you do research, you have to really get smart on all the research on that topic that's happened to date to avoid wasting time and to make sure that you're actually contributing to the literature. Because you cannot get published if you're just doing some study from the top of your head that really isn't contributing to what has already taken place. Also, replication is important in research. You want to replicate what has been found in the past to see if it holds up. So when you start a study, you have to hit the literature and find journal articles. And you need to read the abstract to make sure it's something that's actually important to your research. When I do research, a lot of times I get frustrated because I read the title and it seems perfect, and then I read the abstract and go, well, crap, it's not even relevant to my study, moving on. Then you'll see the introduction, and that is really just a broad summary of all the past research that is important for your topic. So it gives the reader an opportunity to see, okay, what's the current state of the field of study in this topic, and then what's missing from the current state of research, and how does this study aim to address those gaps in past research. Then the method really tells you how the person or people conducted the research. It is the recipe for the study, and the method needs to be specific. So again, if somebody wants to replicate your findings, they'll be able to do exactly what you did. The method is also important so you can evaluate the quality of the study to see if the findings are really reliable and valid. Then the most important part of a journal article is the results section. So the results section really just describes what was found, right? So the method tells you how the data was collected, and then the results tell you what that data revealed about what those researchers were trying to study. With the results section, you'll typically see numeric values in tables or figures, but you'll also see text that explains those results. Then the discussion section really kind of takes it all together. It goes, okay, how do these results compare to what we expected, or, the hypotheses? So it's important to mention that your hypotheses are stated at the end or throughout the introduction. But the discussion just kind of reflects on, okay, what are the key takeaways of the results? How does that compare to what we expected based on past research? Why are these results important in the real world? And then what were some of the limitations of our study that should be corrected in the future? And then what are some of the strengths of the study that make it such an awesome study in the first place? Then, of course, the references. So the references are there so that if you're reading through a journal article, you're going to see citations. So like some last names and some years. And those citations tell you what they're saying was based on. So especially in the introduction, you're going to see statements about past research, and you'll see a citation that tells you what study they're talking about. Well, if you're reading a journal article and you see something particularly relevant or interesting, then you look at the citation, then you take that citation, go to the reference section and find it, and then you can actually locate that journal article for yourself. So now I want you to find the journal article that is posted along with this lecture and just quickly skim it and think about what should be in each section. Don't agonize over it, don't highlight it, don't study it. Just quickly go through it, kind of look at the different sections and kind of say, oh, okay, this looks like what a method should be or what an intro should be. Also, see the citations and then see how those are reflected in the reference section. And, same shameless self-promotion. This is actually an article that I am an author on that I worked on, and I think it'll be kind of neat for you to see some of the research that I'm involved in. So now that you've taken a moment to read through this journal article, and this may have been the first time that you've ever even looked at a journal article, I hope not, but I am fully prepared for that being the case, and I want to help you get better at doing this because it is important to be able to understand and apply research. So now that you've just kind of exposed yourself to that and looked at it, now I really want you to dive deep into how to make sense of a journal article. This is a skill that takes a lot of time to develop, but I feel like this lecture will really give you a head start in this because most people, even advanced students who are seniors or who are psych majors and have done research, don't really have a good concrete process for how to quickly make sense of a journal article and save yourself a lot of time and stress. So again, you want to start off by quickly reading the abstract. That really tells you the highlights of the article. And if you're doing research on your own and you decide, oh, this is a study that's relevant to me, then you're going to jump into this process. So you'll write a one-sentence description of the key study results in your own words. Remember, plagiarism is not acceptable. Don't copy and paste ever, even for a placeholder. Read something, put it away, and then try to write down what you got from it in your own words. Writing a one-sentence description is going to be challenging, but brevity is important. You want to get really good at getting things down succinctly, to the point, clear and concise. If there's anything in the abstract that you find confusing, maybe jot that down so that you can look for that later in the article. Then you want to quickly read the article without freaking out about the details and the nitty-gritty and trying to highlight and write things down. You can highlight some statements that maybe address those questions you had about the abstract or that seem, really, really relevant. But again, never copy and paste, and don't freak out about the article. There's certain sections of the article that you should agonize over, but just quickly read it, kind of highlight or mark, oh, this seems really important, and then start to try to summarize. So now you go back with a more critical eye. You look through the article again, you summarize it in your own words, but only focus on the most important pieces of information. There's never really going to be a need to summarize an entire article. You may need a little bit from the intro, but mostly it's going to be about the results and how to apply those results. So when you're looking at the introduction, you want to think about the basic background information for the topic. Also, think about which hypotheses are the most relevant or interesting to you. Some journal articles are testing a ton of hypotheses, and not all of them are always going to be relevant, but some of them may be especially relevant. So maybe mark those and write those down. When it comes to the method, really just think about how good of a study it is. Oftentimes, you're not going to worry about writing down like the sample size or any of that, but just think about, okay, how big is this sample? Does this sample really represent the population? So for instance, in this article, we're only looking at academic faculty, but we really are trying to study the frog pond effect among all employees. Well, wonder to yourself, is the experience of academic faculty the same as people in different organizations? Well, maybe not. So maybe these results can't be just taken at face value, and you might want to consider the nature of employees. And if we see these results again and again in different types of employees, then we can be more confident it's a universal phenomenon. Then also think about how things are measured, because when you look at the results section, you're going to have to think about, okay, well, how was this measured and what was this construct? If you're ever confused about what a construct or what a variable is that's being measured, you can usually look at the method section and there'll be sample items that help you figure that out. Also, you're going to see study limitations in the discussion. There's usually a limitation section. So if you're not really comfortable with evaluating the merit of a study from the method, you can look at the discussion and kind of get an idea of how great of a study it was. Then the results in the discussion. So the key findings for those hypotheses are in both of those sections. Typically the results have the tables and figures and kind of a sophisticated explanation, and then the results are rehashed in a more simplistic way in the discussion, usually at the beginning of the discussion. As you go through a results section, don't freak out if it's scary and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If you look hard enough, you're going to see that the authors have explained those findings for you without you necessarily needing to understand the tables and figures. But in this lecture, I'm going to show you how to understand those tables and figures because it's a lot quicker to look at the tables than to try to find it in text. Then, most importantly, the discussion tells you how these findings would apply to the real world. What should people in organizations do to their employees or in their organization based on this research? So in addition to giving you some tips about how to make sense of a journal article and how to approach summarizing research, I'm going to actually give you an example of this based on the article that you read. So here is that abstract from the journal article, and just quickly read that again, and then maybe even take a stab at summarizing it in your own words in maybe 1 or 2 sentences before you move on in this lecture. So here is my 1-sentence summary of the abstract, and you can see it is very concise, to the point. Yes, it lacks some of the details from the abstract, but that's important because you can't capture all that in a summary. Remember, summaries are supposed to be kind of a condensed, shortened version of what you've read. So you see academic staff who are individually impacted by budget cuts tended to experience more negative outcomes when they were in a department that was less impacted by budget cuts. So that gets at that frog pond effect. It doesn't get into specific outcomes. It's just very broad and very basic. But it's also detailed at the same time. Then if you're reading this, I was thinking, what would a student or somebody who's not familiar with this field of study be confused about? And I think maybe how was this impact of budget cuts measured, and then what the heck is psychological contract breach would be 2 things that you may see in the abstract that you want to research further to figure out. So now if you went back through and read the article more carefully, you could look for statements that address those questions about the abstract. So you'll see this excerpt from the journal article, and you'll notice that in the journal article that I posted, these same things are highlighted, so you'll be able to identify where these things are located in a journal article. So let's take a look. How was the impact of budget cuts measured? So this comes from the methods section, and you'll see that we looked at the individual level and also the departmental level. So the individual level measures came from survey items that were answered by each person in the study, and we basically just looked at how have these budget cuts negatively affected your ability to teach, and how have they negatively affected your scholarly productivity? And scholarly productivity is just their ability to publish research. And those are really the two things at this particular university where we study this. Those were the two main metrics for performance and how you got tenure and how you got promotion and what you were judged based on. Then we looked at a departmental level measure where we actually asked the department heads to respond to 10 items about how the budget cuts impacted the department. So instead of asking the individuals about the departmental level, we actually asked the bosses of each department how their department was impacted. So we had the individual level, each person, and then department level, the departmental head for all those individuals. Also in the method, you could shed some light on what is psychological contract breach. So it's basically just a violation of promises that were made. So it's their failure to fulfill their promises and commitments to staff. So you can see some sample items here. In general, the university has lived up to its promises. Overall, the university has fulfilled its commitments to me. So these were reverse coded so that higher numbers meant more psychological contract breach, because a breach would be not meeting the promises and not fulfilling commitments. Now, the introduction section of a journal article is where you can find the basic background information for a topic. So what has past research found that's relevant to my study? And it's also where you can find hypotheses, but for now we'll just focus on kind of the background and the literature review that they did for their topic. So there is quite a comprehensive literature review in this article, but I just took a little piece of it and highlighted it to show you where some of the information about the basic background of the topic is. Typically, the background includes theories that are driving the research. So a theory is kind of an explanation for things that have been observed. And then also looking at, what has happened in the past and how does this study go beyond that. So take a moment to read the highlights. Maybe try to summarize this on your own before you look at the next slide. So make sure that whenever you're doing a summary, that it is a shortened, condensed version of what you read. It doesn't have the same sentence structure as the original, and it is in your own words. Also, be sure to always, always, always cite. So you'll see here, according to Zhang, Probst, and Benson, that's the original article, it's cited. The frog pond effect and relative deprivation theory, so the two theories that this study is really investigating with citations, support the notion that people's experiences are judged according to what others around them are experiencing and how others are being treated. So that is very plain English way to explain this in your own words. While this seems relevant in the workplace, few studies have examined such social comparisons among employees, so there's kind of a gap in past research. As such, this study aims to examine the impact of social comparisons at work, so that is how this study takes past research a step further and contributes to past literature. I also like pictures. Pictures help me understand things. So here's kind of a visualization of the frog pond effect and relative deprivation theory. So if you're undergoing budget cuts or some sort of thing that is stressful in your environment, but you're surrounded by people who are really happy, you are going to be in greater agony. You're like, why me? Why is this happening? Conversely, if you're going through the exact same circumstances, but you're surrounded by people who are also in agony or even worse off than you, then you're going to feel a little bit better about your circumstances. You're not going to be happy, but you're not going to be as upset. So that's just kind of a visual of frog pond effect and relative deprivation theory, and really what you're going to see in a little bit, the hypotheses that we expected for this study. The main hypothesis is that if you're surrounded by people who are doing better than you, but you're not doing so well, you're going to have worse outcomes. So as I mentioned earlier, sometimes not every single hypothesis in a study is relevant to you. So usually you go through and you figure out, based on the introduction and based on what your study is, which hypotheses are the most relevant or interesting to you. And typically they'll be clearly labeled. It'll say hypothesis 1, hypothesis 2, or research question 1 or research question 2. If you see research questions, that means that that study is looking at something that isn't quite well researched, and it's more of an investigation instead of trying to confirm specific hypotheses. So hypotheses are more grounded on past research, and research questions are more exploratory. But again, they're in the introduction, and they're usually spelled out for you. So this article had 3 hypotheses. The first and the second are more of a replication, and then the third one, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many people who have cited this article, that third hypothesis is more interesting and more novel. So let's first start off with hypothesis 1. So looking at the main effect of just looking at individual impact of budget cuts on these outcomes. And again, words are great, but I love a visual. So this visual is showing you greater individual impact of budget cuts is hypothesized to lead to less job satisfaction, less affective commitment, or really like an emotional attachment to the organization, more psychological contract breach, or remember that feeling that your promises have been violated, and also more turnover intentions or a desire to quit. Now, hypothesis 2 is also for a main effect. So main effect, just looking at one variable at a time and how it impacts the outcomes. So in this case, the impact of budget cuts would be your independent variable. And then these are your dependent variables, your outcomes. But we're basically just saying departmental budget cuts are going to have a similar impact as the individual budget cuts. It's not a good thing. Now, hypothesis 3 is really the hypothesis that's looking at a moderation effect or an interaction effect. And I'll get into that a little bit more here in the stats portion of this lecture. But this is how an interaction effect is usually pictured. And our interaction effect is saying that the impact of individual budget cuts on these outcomes depends on the departmental impact. So we're thinking that if you have greater individual impact, but you're surrounded by people who are better off than you, you're going to have worse outcomes. So the method section is important for those who are wanting to replicate the study, but even if not, if you want to evaluate the quality of the study to decide how much you should trust those findings, you should look at the method. Specifically, you should think about the sample size, how representative the sample is of the people that they are trying to make inferences about based on the study, and then how variables were measured, and just kind of critiquing how good of a study this really is. So here are some excerpts from the method section. And again, these highlighted sections are highlighted in the article copy that I gave you as well. So you can see that here we looked at individual and department level data. We looked at academic staff. We also looked at the heads of departments, and we were studying a large public university located in the northwestern United States. We did survey-based research, and we're in a situation where the university lost half of its state-supported funding. So we're looking at serious budget cuts within the university. Also looking at the departmental level measure, where department impact was looked at from the department heads again. So based on this, you could summarize the method as saying, Zhang et al., 2014, conducted a survey study examining faculty and staff and department heads at a large public university that experienced major budget cuts. See how that doesn't keep the same sentence structure? It's in my own words, and it really gets at the heart of the method. Now, if you are not an expert in research methodology and you have a hard time critiquing a study's merits based on a method section, you can always go to the discussion where they talk about the limitations. So you'll see it's talking about a cross-sectional study. So cross-sectional just means we only measured it once. We didn't look at changes over time. Correlational data, so we just did naturalistic observation. We just looked at how things are related in the real world. We didn't manipulate anything or do a true experiment. Also, talking about, future studies should do longitudinal assessment instead of cross-sectional. Also, we just looked at university staff, so you might not be able to generalize or relate the findings to people in other realms or other domains of different types of workplaces. So it's not a true experiment. We can't do any cause or effect, right? No causal relationships. It's a survey study. And also, we only looked at academia, so results may not apply in another setting. But I do want to point out that the budget cut situation was a prime way to study social comparison. It was a situation where not everybody was equally impacted, but serious problems were happening in the work environment. Also, it was a strength that we didn't just ask individuals about their department and then kind of aggregate that to decide how the department was doing. We actually got a second source of information about budget cuts in the department by asking the department heads how things were going in the department. So we're about a half hour into this lecture, and it is about to get intense. We are going to start focusing on statistics. I love statistics. Statistics is powerful. Throughout the semester, you're going to get much more comfortable with statistics, but I know for many of you this is a little bit scary, and it's going to take a lot of focus for this next section of the lecture. And this is important stuff. You've got to be able to understand a results section in a journal article to summarize research findings. So this may be a good time to take a break, get a cup of coffee, or drink a glass of water, or maybe do some jumping jacks, or go play with your kids or your dog or whatever. Disconnect for a little bit, and then come back prepared to really focus on the statistics section of this lecture so that you'll be able to summarize the key findings for your hypotheses of interest. So here we are, the statistics review. Now, I'm a statistics instructor, and it is my favorite class to teach. And I could probably, well, in fact, I have done a whole semester on statistics. But for our purposes, I'm only going to focus on the bare minimum that you need to get by with this class and summarizing empirical research. So this is going to be a very applied, very, drilled down version of a statistics review. And hopefully throughout the semester, you can go back to this and get some help with looking at results sections. And I'm also here to help you too if you're having questions or problems as the semester goes on. So let's start with the basics of descriptive statistics. So descriptive statistics are designed to just describe a sample of data or a population if you have access to everybody that you want to study. You're not trying to look at differences between groups or if there's significant relationships. You're really just trying to use descriptive statistics to describe the nature of your data. So there's the mean, the median, and the mode. Mode is the most frequent value, the most commonly occurring value. The median is your midpoint, just tells you what value separates the bottom 50% from the top 50%. Then the mean is just a fancy statsy word for the average. So you add all the scores together and divide by how many scores that you had. So for instance, if we measured people's age and we had 20 and someone who was 30, the average age would be, or the mean age would be 25, right? Because 20 plus 30 is 50. We had 2 data points, and 50 divided by 2 is 25. So that would be the average or the mean. Now, the standard deviation is the measure of variability. It just tells you, on average, how spread out our scores from the mean. So if we thought about this situation, our standard deviation would be a 5 because our mean is 25, 20 is 5 points away from 25, and 30 is also 5 points away from 25. So on average, the scores are 5 points away from the mean. Now that is a very, very basic, simple example, but it helps drive the point home of what the standard deviation is. The higher the standard deviation, higher the SD, means that scores are more spread out. So more spread out, more variability, more bigger differences. This is hard to do with a mouse. There we go. Conversely, a smaller standard deviation means that scores are more consistent, closer together, not as spread apart. Now, in journal articles, typically, you're going to be seeing the mean and the standard deviation, not so much about the median and the mode. So oftentimes you will see the mean and standard deviation presented at the beginning of a correlation table. So this is really where we're focusing right now. And before you can really evaluate the mean and standard deviation, like is the mean high? Like did people have high ratings for this or low ratings for this? You need to look at the method and you need to see what the range was for the measures. So for everything except job satisfaction right here, everything but job satisfaction was measured on a 7-point scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. So if we're looking at the means here, we can say, okay, well, clearly the personal impact of budget cuts was the most highest rated thing. But how high is a 4.85 really? If this was a 5-point scale, that 4.85 would be extremely high, and I'd be real worried about these people. They are really experiencing some impacts. But a 4.85 is still pretty high on a 7-point scale, but it's closer to the middle than it would be if it was a 5-point scale. You can also see that the lowest rating thing here was psychological contract breach. We're ignoring job satisfaction because it wasn't measured on the same scale, which is a good thing. They didn't feel like their promises were being too broken. And then if we look at the 3-point scale for job satisfaction, it looks like these people are fairly highly satisfied. The standard deviation tells you again how consistent these things are. So if we ignore job satisfaction because it was measured on a different scale, and we look at these, the departmental impact was the most consistent thing. So most departments were undergoing kind of similar levels, in the middle of impacts. And the most inconsistent thing that was rated was the psychological contract breach. So yes, this is a low mean, relatively speaking, but some people were experiencing a lot of psychological contract breach and some people were experiencing very little. If you want to know the range of most ratings, you can take this 3.47 and subtract 1.51, and I'm just going to do that right now. So 3.47 minus 1.51, and you get, 1.96. So 1.96. And then you take that mean and add the standard deviation, so 3.47 plus 1.51. And you get 4.98. So on a 7-point scale, the majority of participants rated their psychological contract breach between roughly a 2 and a 5. You're never going to have to do this in this class, but I hope it gives you a better understanding of how the mean and standard deviation work together to tell you kind of what the data was looking like. So before we move on to looking at more sophisticated statistical analyses than just descriptive statistics, we've got to discuss the statistical significance. So in journal articles, statistical significance is reported as a p-value. So the p-value is a probability, and it tells you how likely it is that the results that you observed are due to a fluke, or due to random chance, or due to sampling error, and not the independent variable. So we want that value to be low. We want there to be a low probability that the results are a fluke. Conversely, that means that there's a high likelihood that the results are actually due to the independent variable and what we actually did in the study. So there's a saying in statistics, and so the null hypothesis is often abbreviated like this, hypothesis with like a 0 for null. And our saying is, if the p is low, reject the hoe. And that's a good thing because the null hypothesis goes against us. I just wanted to say ho, I'm not going to lie. It helps keep you awake. So when we look at the p-value, we want it to be low so that we can reject the null hypothesis and say that the hypothesis that we proposed is the correct hypothesis. So the closer that our p-value is to 0, the happier that we are. The closer it is to 1, the sadder we are, because if it's 1, that means there's a 100% chance that sampling error caused the results. See our dude down here? We get real excited when our p-value is less than 0.05. So 0.05 means that there's less than a 5% chance that our results are due to a fluke. And usually 0.05 is kind of the criteria for calling a finding significant. So if there's less than a 5% chance that our results are faulty, we'll call a finding significant and we will celebrate and support our hypothesis that we proposed. So if you get a significant finding, that means that you're pretty confident that your hypothesis is correct, that what you observed in your sample is actually due to what you thought it was due to the independent variable, or was due to what you did in your study. So you're also confident that what you observed in your sample would also be observed in the population. If our findings in our sample are actually due to the independent variable, then that independent variable would probably function in the same way in the population. Also, you have to consider, just because you get a significant result, it is a thing to celebrate. You are confident in your findings, but you also have to consider the quality of your study when you're evaluating how much we think that there's a cause effect here, how comfortable we are with telling everybody our results and thinking it's going to happen in the real world. So the takeaway from the slide: low p-value is a good thing. It means that your findings are more reliable, that you're confident that what you observed in your study is actually legit and actually based on what you did in your research. So here is your correlation table again at the top, and then here's a more complicated table from the article looking at the regression coefficients. But for now, I just want you to focus on all these correlations. And we'll look at how to interpret correlations in a little bit. But all these values are significant. P less than 0.01. So even better than P less than 0.05, there is less than a 1% chance that these observed correlations are due to a fluke or are due to sampling error. So conversely, there's about a 99% chance that these are true correlations or true relationships among these variables. Now here you will see slightly different thing for the p-values. So if there is a little cross, let's see if I can find one right here, that means that there's less than a 10% chance that that's a fluke. If you see 1 star, see if I can find one with 1 star. Yep, significant at 0.05, meaning less than a 5% chance that results are a fluke. If you see 2 stars, like this guy here, less than a 1% chance that results are a fluke. And if you see 3 stars, it's even more reliable because you can see that there's less than a, if I turn this into a percent, a 0.1% chance that results are just a fluke. So the more stars, the more confident we are that the results aren't due to error. The results are actually due to true relationships among our variables. And this is a really common way to show statistical significance in journal articles. So you'll see this again when you're doing your article summaries. So just because a finding is statistically significant doesn't mean that it is practically significant or that it is really of substantial impact or relationship. So whenever you're thinking about, okay, how much of an impact did X have on Y? Or how strong of a relationship is there between these two things? You have to think about effect size. How much of an effect is happening? Just because it's reliable, just because the effect isn't due to chance, doesn't mean that it's a substantial effect. This is really important in drug research. If you are testing the effectiveness of a new drug, you want to make sure not just that it has a significant improvement on symptoms, but that it improves symptoms beyond the effect that's already taking place with the current drugs on the market, right? You want to have a stronger effect size than what's already out there. So 2 measures of effect size are R squared and something called eta squared. You don't need to know that, just that, those are measures of effect size. And the way that those work is it tells you the proportion of all the differences or variability in the dependent variable that is due to the independent variable or independent variables. And this ranges from 0 to 1 or 0% to 100%. So here are the evaluations of effect size. Anything around a 0.01 is a small, 0.09 is medium, and 0.25 is large. Now you may think to yourself, 0.25, that's only 25% of the differences in what we are in our outcome that's due to what is supposed to be affecting it, or our independent variable. But this is still a large effect because there's a lot of different things in the world that are impacting our outcomes that we look at in research, or our dependent variables. So capturing 25% of that is actually really, really big. So here's a nice little example. I like r squared and eta squared because you can think about it as a pie, like you see down here. So let's say that we're doing a study and we're looking at creativity. So creativity is our dependent variable. And we're doing a study to see if the work group diversity, so having, diverse backgrounds in your work group, improves creativity. So work group diversity would be our independent variable. And let's say that we get a significant impact and the effect size is 0.28. Well, that means that 28% of all the differences in creativity is actually due to the diversity of the work group. Now, that leaves 72% of the differences that are unexplained. It's probably due to a whole host of other things that impact creativity. But we were able to explain 28% of the differences in creativity just based on work group diversity. So that would be a large effect. So now let's take a look at effect size in actual statistical tables. So if we look at the correlation table up here in table 1, you can just square a correlation to get the effect size. So r squared is a measure of effect size, and these correlation coefficients are referred to as an r. So let's look at the relationship here, right? The correlation between variable number 1, personal impact, and variable number 2, right, that's at this row, job satisfaction. So if you take negative 0.20 times negative 0.20, you would get an r squared of 0.04. So 4% of the differences in job satisfaction are being explained by the personal impact of budget cuts. So you can do that for any of these correlations, and we'll look at correlation tables more thoroughly here in a minute, but you can do that to get the effect size. Now, if we look at the table 2, this explained variance is the effect size. And check it out. This table is looking at the personal impact, the individual level, and the departmental impact, and how these two things work together. But in this first model, A1, it's only looking at the personal impact. And look at that 4%. Look familiar? Same thing. We're going to look at these tables more thoroughly in a little bit, but with this model, A3 is taking everything into account, right? Personal, departmental, and then the two together. And with all those things together, we are predicting 5% of the differences in job satisfaction with all of those things put together. So there's where you'll find the effect sizes in a regression table, usually. So I just want to familiarize you with the different types of commonly used analyses in behavioral sciences research. So if you're examining differences across groups, like for instance, if you're looking at differences in job satisfaction among those in the retail industry, those in the restaurant industry, and then people who work at colleges and universities and academia, you could do t-tests or analysis of variance. Technically, you do an ANOVA because you're looking at 3 groups, but we won't get into that. So that's one type of study that you could see. Also, if you're looking at frequencies across groups, where maybe you are looking at the number of employees based on gender and industry, and you're counting how many males are in retail and how many males are in restaurant, you could do a chi-square analysis, and you might see that in an article. But the one that's the most common is looking at relationships and making predictions. So correlation is all about examining relationships, and regression is all about making predictions. Now, whenever there's results about these in a journal article, it is pretty straightforward, but when it comes to interpreting correlation and regression, it is a little more complicated and really deserves an overview to help you understand those types of results. So that's really what I'm going to focus on in this lecture, is understanding correlation, looking at relationships, and then regression, using those relationships to then make predictions. So now I'm going to provide you with a pretty in-depth overview of correlation analysis and how to make sense of correlation results. So a correlation is when you examine the relationship between two numeric variables in a single group. So you're not comparing different groups, right? You're not looking at job satisfaction in retail versus restaurant industry. You would be looking at maybe job satisfaction and budget cuts, right? Within all employees lumped together. So looking at a single group and looking at two different variables. Typically, the variable that is labeled X is assumed to be the independent variable, so the cause, and the dependent variable is often labeled Y, or the effect or outcome. But remember, in correlation research, there is no cause and effect, but based on the past research that you highlighted in your introduction section of your manuscript, if you were writing one, you would have a pretty idea of what comes first, and then what is usually happening as a result of that. Also, keep in mind that there's a ton of different types of correlations, but for the most part, we are looking at Pearson's R, which is examining linear relationships where there's a consistent increase or a consistent decrease in Y as X increases or decreases. There's certain types of relationships that are like curvilinear, like this, or like this. But most commonly, we're looking at linear relationships. As X increases, Y tends to increase or decrease consistently. Also, correlation is used to look at the reliability of certain scales. So this is using Cronbach's alpha. So remember, from the method section, you'll see that multiple items are used to measure one thing, right? There's multiple items used to measure job satisfaction. Well, Cronbach's alpha tells you if all those items that were used to measure that one thing are related. So a higher Cronbach's alpha is a good thing. That means there's more internal consistency. That means that the people's responses on those items were similar, which suggests that those items are measuring the same thing. So correlations involve direction and strength, but let's first focus on direction. So the direction of a correlation is told to you by the sign of the actual value. So remember, the correlations that we looked at earlier when we were looking at effect size were negative. So now you're going to know what that actually means. So if you have a positive correlation, that means that X and Y, whatever two variables you're looking at, tend to change in the same direction. As X increases, Y tends to increase. As X decreases, Y tends to decrease. So they're changing in the same direction. So for instance, older people tend to be more stressed out. And you'll see that in the scatter plot, it's got kind of like an upward thing. It's a positive direction, right? Older, more stressed. And if you look at this coefficient for the correlation, it's actually a 0.95, which is a positive number. Now let's look down here at a negative relationship when X and Y tend to change in opposite directions. So those with higher levels of X tend to have lower levels of Y. Those with lower levels of X tend to have higher levels of Y. So a silly example would be your age and parties this year. As you get older, the number of parties that you have tends to decrease. Notice I didn't say as those who are older have fewer parties, right? That would be a causal statement. Correlation is not causation, but I'm saying those who are older tend to have fewer parties. You also see there's a negative here, right? Those who are older tend to have fewer parties. When you are summarizing results, and it is from correlational research, like survey-based studies, or when they're just looking how things are related and nothing was truly manipulated, do not say X causes Y, or those with X have Y, or anything like that. Use tends to. Tends to. That's kind of your safe way to not overstate the causality of findings. Tends to shows that you're not saying it's a cause and effect, but it is a tendency based on the relationship found in the data. So tends to. And again, positive correlation, X and Y tend to change in the same direction. Negative, X and Y tend to change in the opposite direction. So now that you've looked at direction, right? Are they changing in the same or opposite directions? Let's focus on strength. And the strength is told to you by the numeric value of the correlation coefficient. So correlations really range anywhere from, if we're looking at negatives, from -1 to +1. You're never going to have a correlation that exceeds the absolute value from 0 to 1, ever. You're never going to have a correlation of -1.3 or 1.2 or 5 or -6 or anything like that. They're always going to be between -1 and +1. The closer you get to the absolute value of 1, the stronger the correlation is. So you can have a correlation near a -1 and it's still strong. Don't look at a negative number and go, oh, it's weak. It's not weak. It can be strong. It just means that it's going in a negative direction, changing in opposite ways. The closer that your correlation coefficient gets to 0, the weaker it is. Okay. So if you visualize this, stronger relationships tend to be more linear. They come closer to a straight line. So what we looked at earlier, right? So this 0.95 is pretty darn close to 1. It's a really strong relationship. Just like this -0.91 is really close to -1. It's a really strong relationship. It's just one is positive and one is negative. The closer to 0, the weaker the relationship. So getting into this range right here. So -0.01 is very inconsistent. If we look at the relationship between age and IQ, you see that it's not linear. It's scattered, right? We have somebody who is older here and kind of falls in the middle. We have also somebody who's younger here and kind of falls in the middle. We have somebody who's a little older and is way up high on the IQ, and also somebody who is younger and is way up high on the IQ. So it's just spread out. It's not consistent. In terms of numeric values, any absolute value of a correlation near 0.10, so if it's near -0.10 or +0.10, weak, near -0.30 or +0.30, moderate, and any correlation around -0.50 or +0.50 is considered strong. So again, the closer to 0, the weaker. The further away you get from 0, the stronger, and you're never going to have a correlation that exceeds 1 or is less than -1. So now let's take a quick look at a correlation table and how to interpret those correlation values now that you have a better understanding of strength and direction and statistical significance of findings. So the way that you interpret a correlation table is you look for where the column and the row meet, and then that correlation coefficient tells you the relationship between those two variables. So for instance, variable number 1 is the personal impact of budget cuts. And if we look at this row is for job satisfaction. So the correlation between personal impact and job satisfaction is -0.20. If we look over here, this is the correlation between number 3, affective commitment, and psychological contract breach, what that row is. So there is a correlation of -0.53 between affective commitment and psychological contract breach. Now, if we think about what correlation tells you, we know this is strong and negative, right? -0.53. So we know that those who are experiencing higher levels of affective commitment tend to experience less psychological contract breach. Or maybe it goes the other way. Those who experience more psychological contract breach tend to be less committed effectively to the organization. If you want to put it in more plain English, you could say those who have promises broken tend to have less of an emotional attachment to the organization based on this correlation. And again, remember I'm saying tends to because it's not a causal relationship. It's just a relationship. All right? So if we think about this, for now we're going to ignore these values in parentheses. We'll talk about that in just a second. But what we're really focusing right now is on these correlation coefficients right here. All right. So remember, we were really, for the hypotheses, focused mainly on how personal impact of budget cuts and the departmental impact of budget cuts impacted these outcomes. Now you'll see that these are all dashes for departmental impact because we didn't have individual level data for that. Remember we asked department heads. So we can't look at that in the correlation analysis. We'll look at that later. So for now, let's just focus on this number 1 column where we see all the relationships with everything with personal impact of budget cuts. So if we look at this first one, we can see that there's a negative correlation between personal impact, number 1, and job satisfaction, meaning that those who have more of a personal impact of budget cuts tend to have less job satisfaction. If we go down here, now we're looking at affective commitment and personal impact. Those with a higher personal impact of budget cuts tend to have less affective commitment, right? Negative correlation. Then if we look here, these are both positive correlations. So those who experience a higher personal impact of budget cuts tend to have higher levels of perceived psychological contract breach and higher turnover intentions. Or in other words, they feel that promises were broken more and they want to quit their jobs more. They tend to want to quit their jobs more. So here that is spelled out for you, right? Employees who experienced more of an individual impact of budget cuts, right? We're looking at number 1 and our first hypothesis, tend to have less job satisfaction, negative, lower affective commitment, negative correlation, but had more perceived psychological contract breach, right, or felt that the organization was breaking promises, and had higher or turnover intentions, they wanted to quit their jobs. And again, always cite. Cite, cite, cite. So real quickly, just looking at interpreting Cronbach's alpha, so you'll see that in this table it says reliability estimates or coefficient alpha are on the diagonal. So the diagonal is right here, these guys right here. So in a correlation table, you're not going to report the correlation between 1 and 1, right, the variable in itself. So the diagonal is reserved for those reliability coefficients or Cronbach's alpha. And as a general rule, you want your Cronbach's alpha to be, this is the symbol for alpha, greater than or equal to 0.70. If they're greater than or equal to 0.70, then that means that, for instance, here's the best one, right, 0.91. So all the items that we use to measure psychological contract breach had similar responses for each individual. So if somebody rated one item as a 5, they tended to rate the other items for that construct around a 5, right? So those items tended to have similar responses for each person. The lowest level of internal consistency was for turnover intentions. So that was the least reliable measure that we had, but it was still pretty close to 0.70, so we left it as is. In research, sometimes if you don't have something around a 0.70, you might look at the specific items and see, based on the stats, which ones you can get rid of. Maybe some items didn't work out so well. But we're feeling pretty good about the measures. All of these are pretty reliable. So now we're going to jump into multiple linear regression. So regression is really just an extension of correlation. You're taking that observed relationship between variables and using that to make predictions. So in traditional regression, you would end up having an equation where you can plug in any value of all the independent variables that you looked at in your study to get a predicted value for the dependent variable. So insurance companies use this where they will say, okay, we don't just want to look at one independent variable. We don't want to look at one predictor of how much of a risk you are to the company, right? The risk would be the dependent variable. We want to look at multiple factors. So we're going to do a multiple linear regression equation where we're going to plug in your age. We're going to plug in your credit score. We're going to plug in the age of your vehicle, how many DUIs you've had, all sorts of variables into this one equation to predict how much of a risk you are to the company to then decide how much to charge you for insurance. So that is a practical application of multiple linear regression, but a more researchy application is to look at the relationship between one independent variable and one dependent variable, while also controlling for other independent variables. So you can simultaneously examine multiple independent variables at once to see how they together impact a dependent variable. And this is really nice because remember, a correlation only allows you to look at two variables at once, but a multiple regression allows you to look at several independent variables simultaneously to see which independent variable has the strongest relationship with the dependent variable, while controlling for the fact that a lot of your independent variables are co-occurring. So sometimes if you have a relationship between X and Y, for instance, you might think that's a really strong relationship, but maybe the only reason that X and Y are related is because both X and Y are related to Z, some third variable. So for instance, in the study we're looking at, maybe the relationship between the personal impact of budget cuts and job satisfaction is only there because the personal impact of budget cuts and job satisfaction are both really strongly related to the departmental impact of budget cuts. So the multiple regression that we're going to look at allows you to look at the relationship between the personal impact and our outcomes while controlling for the fact that we know that the personal impact and outcomes are probably also related to the departmental impact. And by looking at personal impact and departmental impact at the same time, we can see which one has a stronger relationship with our outcomes. And we can also look to see how personal and departmental impact work together to impact outcomes. So remember, our third hypothesis in the study was, kind of does the impact of personal budget cuts on outcomes depend on the departmental impact, right? If you're surrounded by happy people, do you feel worse? If you're surrounded by unhappy people who are being negatively impacted, do you feel better? So that's what the multiple linear regression allows us to do. Now you'll see the B coefficient when we look at these tables typically, and that interpretation is similar to R, which is the correlation. So if you see a positive B, that means that higher levels of that independent variable are predicting. So if you see a positive B, higher levels, so let's just put that there. Positive B means that higher levels of X are predicting higher levels of Y, and lower levels of X are predicting lower levels of Y. A negative B means that inverse relationship, right? Higher levels of X are predicting lower levels of Y, and lower levels of X are predicting higher levels of Y. So again, the interpretation of B is similar to R. You see this partial here? The partial means that you're looking at the relationship between X and Y while controlling for other things, holding them constant. This will make a lot more sense when we actually look at a practical example right now. So for now, let's only focus on the main effects in this regression table. Now keep in mind, this is multi-level regression or hierarchical regression, and that's a little more complex than the types of analyses that I'm going to have you look at this semester, but this still emphasizes the point of how to interpret multiple linear regression. So just kind of keep that in mind. So let's kind of break this table down. Here, these are the dependent variables that we're looking at in this table, or our outcomes. Job satisfaction and affective commitment. Now you'll see there's different models here, and each model has more lines. I typically only focus on the final model that looks at everything that you see here. Now we are going to ignore, let's cross this out. We're going to ignore all this because this is complex hierarchical regression stuff that I'm not going to have you be looking at this semester. But we can still emphasize the points with this here for what you'll be needing to do. All right, so the intercept you can ignore. Now here we're looking at the individual level or personal impact of budget cuts. Here we're looking at the departmental level. We're going to ignore this part right here for now because we're only focused on main effects, and that's the interaction effect. So, personal impact of budget cuts. That's all represented here. But again, I'm only going to focus on that third model. So I'm really looking right here where we've looked at everything at the same time. That's for job satisfaction. And then here for affective commitment. Then the departmental impact is right here. Oh, no, I'm looking at the wrong thing. Get out of here. Go away. Those are the interactions. We're looking here. That's our departmental impact. All right. So let me break this down for you. This is kind of like the correlation between personal impact and job satisfaction while controlling for the departmental impact, kind of taking that out of the equation. So when we take into account, yes, we know that departmental impact is probably related to personal impact and job satisfaction. We know that's the case. When we take that out of the equation, we still have a significant negative relationship between the personal impact and job satisfaction. So this is stronger evidence beyond just the correlation that we saw earlier that personal impact is a predictor or is related to job satisfaction. Now let's look at the departmental impact. Well, I don't see any stars, right? Remember statistical significance? So since I don't see any stars next to it, that means it is not a significant relationship there. So once we control for personal impact, there's no real relationship between the departmental impact of budget cuts and job satisfaction. Let's look over here. When we simultaneously examine the personal impact and departmental impact, you can see that the personal impact is still significantly negative related to affective commitment. And departmental impact is also related to affective commitment in a similar fashion, right? It's negative, it's moderate relationship there. So just based on this, you could say that those who have a more of a personal impact of budget cuts tend to have lower job satisfaction and less affective commitment, even when you're controlling for departmental impact. And departmental impact, those who have a higher departmental impact of budget cuts also tend to have less affective commitment. So now let's look at psychological contract breach and turnover intentions as dependent variables. And we are going to get rid of this. It's not going to get me again. We don't care about any of this. All right. We're only looking at the main effects right here, looking at one independent variable at a time, not how they work together. All right. So here we go. If we look at psychological contract breach and we look at the personal impact in Model 3 and the departmental impact in Model 3, right, where we look at everything at the same time. And we're also going to look at turnover intentions, so the personal impact and the departmental impact. So if we look at this, we can see that those who experience more of a personal impact of budget cuts tend to have significantly more, right, positive and stars, psychological contract breach, and significantly higher turnover intentions, right? It's a positive correlation. We see the stars, we know it's significant based on our nice little key down here, okay? And this is even after controlling for departmental impact. So again, those who experience a higher individual level or personal impact of budget cuts tend to have significantly higher psychological contract breach and turnover intentions, even after controlling for the departmental impact of budget cuts. So this relationship holds up even after you control for what's going on in their department. When we look at departmental impact, we see that departmental impact, those who have a department who's being more impacted by budget cuts tend to have more psychological contract breach, but not necessarily more turnover intentions. Because there's no stars there, it's not a significant, reliable relationship. And again, that's even after controlling for the personal impact. So even after you control for how much people are individually being impacted by budget cuts, the departmental impact is still a significant predictor of psychological contract breach. So in addition to allowing you to examine multiple independent variables at the same time, multiple regression allows you to look at how those independent variables work together to predict dependent variables. And this is called an interaction or a moderating effect. So here's some examples. So, does the effect of work group diversity on creativity depend on openness of group members? One would suspect that work group diversity would probably be a better or improve creativity more if the group members are open to other experiences and other points of view. Whereas if group members aren't, maybe that work group diversity wouldn't increase the creativity. Or does the effect of budget cuts on job insecurity among professors depend on tenure status? Well, tenured professors have proven themselves. They have guaranteed job security. It's really hard to fire a tenured professor. So chances are the budget cuts would have a stronger impact on job insecurity among professors who do not have tenure, and less of an effect on job insecurity of professors who do have tenure, because it's really hard to fire them even amidst budget cuts. Then relative to this study, does the effect of individual impacts of budget cuts on, say, affective commitment depend on departmental level impacts of budget cuts? Or in other words, is there a frog pond effect or a relative deprivation where how the outcomes you experience don't just depend on what you're experiencing personally, but what's going on around you? And that would be an interaction or a moderating effect that we could look at with this multiple regression. So now we're really focused on this section of the results. So we're really just looking at Model 3 again. Here's psychological contract breach. Here's the coefficient we care about. Here's turnover intentions. And here's the coefficient that we care about. Here's job satisfaction, the interaction effect there. Affective commitment, the interaction effect there. So whenever you see interaction effects, typically it'll be notated as something X, something else, like this. So personal impact by departmental impact. So if we look here, we can see, based on the stars, right, tell us significant findings, that for all of these, the impact of, or the relationship between personal impact and all the outcomes depends on the departmental impact. So it looks like what's going on in your department does have an effect on how the personal impact is related to how you feel in terms of psychological contract breach, turnover intentions, job satisfaction, and affective commitment. Now with interaction effects, you can't just look at that coefficient and know what's going on. This doesn't tell me necessarily if a departmental impact is making it worse or making it better in terms of how much you're affected by a personal impact of budget cuts. So whenever there's an interaction effect, you're going to see graphs that look something like this in the article. So let's take a look at this for a moment. So we can see here, down here represents a low personal impact. Over here represents a high personal impact. So here we're looking at low personal impact, high personal impact. Then the nature of the line tells you if it is a high or low departmental impact. So for instance, let's delete these real quick so we can kind of highlight again. All right. This point represents those who have a low personal impact and a low departmental impact. Whereas this represents people who have a high personal impact and a high departmental impact. All right. So let's kind of look at this. First thing you see is if we're looking at affective commitment, right? Higher numbers are better. So in this particular graph, Who has the highest level of affective commitment? Well, it is those that have a low personal impact and a low departmental impact, low and low. And that makes sense, right? If the budget cuts aren't really affecting you or your department, you're going to feel a stronger emotional connection to the organization. All right, who has the worst outcome? Well, you can see that those with a low departmental impact, but a high personal impact, have the lowest levels of affective commitment. Okay? So it looks like the frog pond effect is happening, right? If you have a high personal impact, let's use blue. Let's say you have a high personal impact, but you're in a department that is also experiencing a lot of budget cuts. Your affective commitment is a little higher than if you're in a department that is experiencing very little budget cuts. Another figure, when you're looking at something where you actually want low scores, right? So you want psychological contract breach scores to be low because that's a bad thing. So who has the worst outcomes in this case? Who has the highest level of psychological contract breach? Yet again, those with the high personal impact, situated in a department with low departmental impact. And then yet again, who has the lowest levels of psychological contract breach? The low lows, right? You aren't experiencing budget cuts personally, and your department is not either. And then this is just a visual representation of the numeric findings, not necessarily the graph, but you can see that the impact of the budget cuts, this is representing the main effects, these black lines. This is representing the main effects of departmental impacts. And then whenever you see a line that goes from like a bubble representing a construct down to a line that represents a main effect, this is just representing a moderated effect, right? This relationship depends on this thing right here. So this is just a visual representation of tables 2 and 3. And you may see something that looks like this reported in a journal article. And here I only reported the significant findings. So in addition to being somewhat familiar with mediation or interaction effects, where the impact of X on Y kind of depends on Z, right? So the impact of personal budget cuts on outcomes kind of depends on the nature of departmental impacts. I also want you to be comfortable with the concept of mediated analysis or a mediation effect. So whereas moderation says, oh, the effect of X on Y, differs depending on Z, mediation really means, okay, X has to go through Y to impact Z. So let's take a look at this, right? So a mediation is saying that departmental budget cuts really don't have any main effect on the outcomes. The only reason that the departmental impact has an effect is because it impacts individual budget cuts. So in mediation, it's saying that this doesn't have a direct relationship with this. The only reason you would see a relationship between these two things is because this first thing impacts the thing that's actually related to the outcomes. That's not what we looked at in this study, but if you ever see a mediation, that is what they're talking about. They're saying, okay, this leads to this, and then that leads to what comes next, but there's no direct relationship between the first thing and the outcomes. So, if this intense section of the lecture on statistics has you sweating a little bit, or your heart's palpitating a little bit, or you're telling yourself, oh my God, why am I taking this class? This is insane. Please do not panic. All right? Even if you cannot read these tables and figures and they do not make sense to you, there is going to be sections in these journal articles that kind of explain it for you. I just want you to understand the stats behind it because it will make it easier. But again, if you're freaking out, do not panic. Don't be overwhelmed. I'm going to show you in this article where you can find explanations of the findings in words, not numbers. So here's that correlation table. Here is where the results of the correlation are described in the results section. So you can see here, as seen in table 1, bam, there's table 1. The perceived impact of budget cuts, so that is on individual staff members, right? That's this, was negatively associated with job satisfaction and affective commitment, and positively associated, right, not negative, with psychological contract breach and turnover intentions. Now, of course, you would need to know what positively and negatively associated mean so that you can then write a plain English explanation in your own words. You can't just write this whenever you're summarizing a journal article, but this helps you understand what you see in the table. So a lot of people are going to look at this and freak out, but again, don't panic. I'm going to show you where in the results section the heart of these analyses and what they tell you really is. And again, explained in words, not spooky freaky numbers. So here's the section of the results section of the article that kind of explains what you see in that table. And the handy thing about journal articles are typically it's going to tell you what hypothesis those results are being reported for. So if you were only interested in hypothesis 2, say from the introduction, you can go to the results section, look to see where it says hypothesis 2, and find the results for that explained. So here, main effects of personal impact, right? So here, perceived personal impact was negatively related to job satisfaction, affective commitment, but positively related to psychological contract breach and turnover intentions. And that's even after we've controlled for departmental impact. So there it is again. Here's main effects for departmental impact. So this is partially consistent with hypothesis 2. When we looked in table 2, right, you saw that, tables 2 and 3. Departmental impact was negatively related to affective commitment, positively related to psychological contract breach, and marginally related to turnover intentions. I don't usually report marginal significance. That 0.10 is just too high. And then remember, departmental impact was not significantly related to job satisfaction. So now I suggest you take a stab at explaining this in your own words before you look at the next slide. This will give you good practice for summarizing research in the future. So again, I love pictures. It helps me a lot. So I took those findings and turned it into a nice little flow chart here. But here's an example of how you could write the key findings for the hypothesis in your own words. So for hypothesis 1, right here, there it is. You can read that on your own. Then for hypothesis 2, which is pictured right here, you can see that as well. And again, I'm kind of taking, instead of saying affective commitment, I'm saying less emotionally attached. Instead of saying psychological contract breach, felt that promises and expectations were not met. If you are explaining results for things that aren't necessarily plain English, right? Psychological contract breach is not something you would ever say in the real world unless you were an IO psychologist or something like that. You need to look at the methods section and be able to explain those things in more plain English. So instead of saying had higher levels of psychological contract breach, you would say felt that promises and expectations were not met, or felt that promises were violated, or something like that that is more plain English, more everyday language. Now let's look at that hypothesis 3, right? The interaction effect or the moderation effect. So individuals who perceived greater personal impact of budget cuts, but were in departments where the departmental head had reported fewer budget cut impacts, reported less job satisfaction, affective commitment, and more psychological contract breach and turnover intentions compared to those experiencing equally high levels in departments. Okay? So that gets back at kind of you're surrounded by happy people. Woo, everything's great. Everything is awesome. Woo! But here you are feeling pretty upset. Okay? It's not a good situation. So before you move on, I want you to take a try at writing down or typing a plain English explanation of those findings. Okay, so here you go. So for hypothesis 3, here you go, right? Department less negatively impacted by budget cuts exacerbates, that's an okay plain English word, makes it worse, right? The negative outcomes of being individually impacted by budget cuts. Now you could technically stop there and you'd probably get, full credit. It would be fine. But if you wanted to be specific, then you could get into the fact that academic faculty and staff more heavily impacted themselves but worked in a department less affected by budget cuts had the, and then mention all those things. Satisfaction with their job, right? I kind of changed it instead of saying job satisfaction. Instead of saying affective commitment, emotional attachment to their organization, which you would know that that's what it is from the method. Highest levels of interest in leaving the organization, right? Instead of saying turnover intentions. And instead of saying psychological contract breach, right? Feeling that promises and expectations were not met. And yet again, cite all the time. So last but not least, it's really important that you understand those findings in an effort to figure out how that would apply to the real world. What could actual people and actual organizations do with this research? Now, although you may have a really cool idea about how this research could be applied in the real world, and in fact, I would love to see that in your summaries. Like, what do you think? How could these results be applied? Typically, your result or your discussion section is going to have practical implications of the research. So you can see here is an excerpt from my journal article with my co-authors on kind of what's going on and how this would apply to the real world, right? So you could see that context matters, right? And let me underline that. So you need to consider your department, right, when predicting employee reactions. Rather than departmental losses actually making the effects worse, we found that the effects of individual loss were made worse when they occurred in a more favorable department, right? Because you may think, more departmental cuts, more individual cuts, worse outcomes. But actually, it's more individual cuts, less departmental cuts, worse outcomes. So this also says, you need to consider the reactions of individuals who are faced with resource loss when they're in the context of a larger unit that has not been as greatly affected. You may feel more isolated. It may be worse, right? But it's better if everybody's in the same boat. Organizations undergoing a loss of resources should really focus on kind of the counterintuitive thing, right? Looking at the processes rather than employee reactions based solely on their level of loss, right? You have to consider the department. And if you have one person who's going through a lot and they're in a department that's not going through as much, really focus on them. So take a stab at summarizing this in your own words. So here is my summary. It's short, it's sweet, it's in language that everybody mostly can understand, right? So results from Zhang et al. Again, cite. It's so important, you got to cite. Suggests that employees who experience resource loss and tend to have a stronger negative reaction if the department level loss was less severe, right? They say, why me? So based on these findings, right? So this is kind of the short and sweet of the results. And then here's the practical implication. Organizational leaders should not assume that employees in the most deprived departments will have the strongest negative reactions. When a loss of resources takes place, you need to focus on mitigating or getting rid of the negative reactions of the most affected people housed in the departments with the fewer losses overall. Okay, so that's my summary. All right. You made it through this lecture. This is probably one of the more intense lectures that you've ever seen, but it's really important to help you get ready for the task of understanding and summarizing journal articles. I have you do this in this class because it's very important to develop this skill. You don't just want to make decisions or make assumptions willy-nilly. It really helps to have actual empirical evidence to back up your decision making in the real world, in the workplace. Also, if you're going to take any other classes where you're going to be doing research and summarizing journal articles, this is going to be a really, really useful skill. Even if you never have to deal with actual empirical research, you know that you see tables and figures and graphs and research suggests all the time in popular media. And if you're able to be a wise consumer of that research, you are going to be much better off in this world. All right? So, it is going to be difficult. You are up for the challenge. I'm here to support you. And please look back on this lecture throughout the semester as you find yourself maybe struggling a little bit with understanding how to summarize actual empirical research. So, I know you can do it. Again, use this as a resource, and I hope you don't feel too overwhelmed at this point.